Hello and welcome everyone. I first would like to thank all of you who requested that I do a short recording of my research and of past topics that I presented at conferences. The topic that I'm going to discuss today is more of a compilation of my experiences as a Muslim researcher with other Muslim and Arab refugees. The reason that I focused on this was because I was given the opportunity to discuss my research within the framework of being a Muslim at a conference that was held in Norway last week. The topic of the presentation was the trauma of being Arab, notes on conducting research with Syrian refugees. Now, how I came to this idea of the trauma of being Arab first started in 2012 when I began to talk to Syrian refugees in Syria, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, within the region, the United States, Canada, and then eventually in Europe in 2015. And as I talked to them, despite their age, their religion, their gender, their education level, a topic continued to emerge, and this topic was trauma. People were expressing the high amount of trauma they were experiencing. And in 2015, my main focus became looking at how could social inclusion and integration happen smoothly. What were going to be the best methods at the local level, the national level, and at the supranational level, meaning EU policy. And I looked at this concept of trauma because it just kept coming up over and over again. And my previous background was as a clinical nutritionist. So I have a tendency to look at things holistically. So when I looked at possible answers to how to progress with social inclusion and integration in Europe, I wanted to focus a bit on trauma. And the trauma that the way it was being described was more as an onion with many, many layers. And I understood very, very quickly and intuitively that, yes, there was the very immediate trauma of having experienced war and death and torture. And Brigitte Lee, a Norwegian psychologist, discusses this concept of triple trauma. One, the trauma of the war zone that a refugee may experience, and two, the journey from their home country to the receiving country, and then the third, trauma of actually integrating, where integration is seen as a trauma. Even with that, there were more layers to this onion. As Syrian refugees began to integrate into their society, there was a backlash in the United States, for sure, in Europe, definitely, of Islamophobia. And this backlash had very deep historical roots. And the EU really did, wrote a few policy briefs discussing the historic roots of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Europe. For Arabs and for Muslims, the concepts of colonization, the Crusades, Mughal invasions, fall of the Ottoman Empire and the subsequent dictatorships that they experienced are all very part of their consciousness, their historic consciousness. Yes, they have this triple trauma, but they also experience a communal trauma. And when they're exposed to Islamophobia, this trauma emerges and it has an impact on how they are going to interact with people within their new home countries. And this is not only important to note for refugees, but also for the host community, because we have very deep preconceived notions of who Muslims are and who Arabs are. But again, as EU policy papers and position papers have drawn out, that not only is it a historical discrimination, but also new post September 11th, where Arabs and Muslims by default are viewed as terrorists and as potentially dangerous to their Western neighbors. So as I did this research and I just thought about what it meant to be a Syrian Arab refugee, because I also do some work with Iraqi refugees. What does it mean for them, these multiple layers of trauma, and how can we move forward in integrating them if we are not only looking at the trauma of leaving, war, integration, but also this historic collective consciousness that both Europe and Syrian Arab Muslims carry as well. Myself, as a Muslim researcher, I'm also exposed to and experience many of the more discriminatory practices from bureaucratic levels, whether or not my papers are authenticated or seen as I'm trying to sneak into the EU, or having to just only speak English and not Arabic so that I'm not discriminated against, having to arrive at the airport a lot earlier because I know I'm going to be randomly selected. So many of these things I've also faced. So I have a deeper understanding of what it feels like, what they're experiencing, because I experienced it myself. But for me, the moment I open my mouth and I say I'm American, especially in Europe, those preconceived notions of me being potentially dangerous or backwards or ignorant, they tend to fall away. So to wrap up this topic, I found that the Arab community, Muslims, experience a high level of trauma. Not just a trauma that is post September 11th or post refugee status, but it's also a longer historical trauma of lacking agency in their life, whether it was through the Crusades or colonization imposing values on a population in their own home country, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and of course with the dictatorship of the Assad family for the last 50 years. So when we think about social inclusion and about integration, we need to take a more holistic view, a view that also takes in consideration history, if we really are going to have a successful and functioning policy. Because these historic currents not only affect refugees, Muslims, and Arabs, they also inform European populations' concepts of who these groups are. And it may not be an accurate picture of who they are. So, just some things to think about. And your comments are welcome. And I look forward to some discussion in the comments. And thank you for taking the time to listen.